Eye for an eye sounds like the most brutal line in the Bible. It is actually one of the most merciful laws ever written down in the ancient world. It did not start a cycle of violence, it stopped one that was already spinning out of control. Long before Moses climbed a mountain, and long before any court existed to enforce a verdict, the book of Genesis already shows us what happens when there is no ceiling on revenge, and it shows us the very first clumsy attempt to build one. After Cain kills his brother Abel, the first murder in the Bible, God does something unexpected. He does not hand Cain over to be killed in return. He puts a mark on him instead, and declares that anyone who kills Cain will face vengeance 7 times over. Read that carefully. That is a limit. The very first recorded attempt in Scripture to say this is where retaliation stops is not a law code, not a court, not a nation. It is a single sentence attached to the world's first murderer, before Israel exists, before Sinai exists, before anything resembling a justice system exists. It does not hold. Long after, a man named Lamech, descended from Cain, killed a young man for striking him. That's it. A blow, then a killing. And instead of hiding what he did, Lamech turned it into a boast. He told his wives, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me." Then he went further. He said, "If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold." Read that again slowly. Cain's protection was set at 7-fold. Lamech looks at that exact number, the number God attached to the world's first murderer, as a limit, and multiplies it by 11 for himself. He is not apologizing. He is not measuring his response to the offense. He is taking the one boundary the Bible had drawn so far and using it as a launching point to announce something far worse. The first attempt at a limit becomes, in Lamech's mouth, a scoreboard. This is what the ancient world looked like without a legal limit on retaliation. A wound could trigger a killing could trigger a massacre. Vengeance had no built-in stopping point because nothing had ever been written down in a way a whole community had to obey, where enough actually was. Across the ancient Near East, retaliation for injury or death was often left entirely to the family of the victim, and family honor demanded that the response be bigger, not equal. Bigger sent a message, bigger protected your name, bigger made sure nobody tried you twice. A private promise from God to one man could not scale to an entire society. What the world needed was not another individual boundary, it needed a rule that applied to everyone, enforced by someone other than the wounded party. The problem is obvious once you say it out loud. If every injury gets answered with a bigger injury, violence never actually ends. It just keeps trading hands, getting worse with each exchange, sometimes for generations, until 2 families are destroying each other over an insult nobody even remembers the details of anymore. This is what the ancient world looked like the book of Exodus was born into. Not a peaceful world looking for an excuse to get harsh, a world already saturated with unlimited, escalating generational payback, where a single bruise could end in a bloodline being wiped out. The pull toward personal vengeance was strong enough that even Israel's own law had to keep building infrastructure to interrupt it. Later, in the book of Numbers, God commands the nation to set aside entire cities of refuge, places where a person who killed someone by accident could run and be protected from a relative of the dead until a proper trial could take place. Think about what that means. Generations after this same nation received the eye for an eye ceiling, the instinct to skip the court and settle things personally was still strong enough that an entire system of cities had to be built just to slow it down. The law was not solving a hypothetical problem, it was holding back something that kept resurfacing in real time. So when a law shows up in Exodus and says the punishment for an injury has to match the injury exactly, no more, That's not the ancient world getting harsher, that's the ancient world getting a ceiling for the very first time. Good intentions were never going to hold that ceiling in place. It needed to be written down in specific enough language that a judge could not quietly bend it back toward whatever a grieving family demanded. That's exactly the language we need to look at next. The phrase itself is only 3 words in Hebrew: ayin, tachat, ayin. I in place of I. It shows up in Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, right in the middle of a case law about 2 men fighting and accidentally injuring a pregnant woman. The whole chapter around it is written the same way, as case law, not sweeping, one-size-fits-all statements, but specific situations worked through in detail, the way a court would actually have to apply them. Here is the exact scene this particular case law is responding to. 2 men are fighting. A pregnant woman gets caught in the middle. If the fight causes her to go into early labor with no lasting harm, the man responsible pays a fine, whatever amount her husband and the court agree on. But if there is lasting harm, if someone actually loses an eye, a tooth, a hand, then verse 24 sets the standard: life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Notice what this formula is actually doing. It is not a command telling victims to go get revenge. It is not even addressed to the victim. It is addressed to the court, setting the ceiling on what a judge is allowed to impose. The punishment has to match the injury. It cannot exceed it. Look closer at the list itself: life, eye, tooth, hand, foot, burn, wound, bruise. That is not a random pile of body parts. It runs from the most severe harm down to the most minor, and the case law right before it in the same chapter is careful to separate an accident from an intentional attack. This is not a blanket "an injury deserves death" rule. It is a graduated scale, built so a court could match the specific consequence to the specific harm, whether that harm was a fatal wound or a bruise that would heal in a week. That small Hebrew word, tachat, is doing more work than it looks. It does not simply mean the same as. Across the Torah, tachat is the word used for substitution and exchange. When Seth is born after Abel's murder, Genesis says he was given tachat Abel, in place of him. Tachat marks something standing in for something else, a fair trade, not a mirror image. Applied here, I tachat I reads less like take the exact same eye and more like the value of an eye in exchange for an eye. That single preposition is the hinge the entire law swings on. And Jewish legal tradition took that reading seriously long before modern scholars ever debated it. The rabbis of the Talmud in the tractate Bava Kama ruled that this law was never meant to be carried out as literal mutilation. Removing an eye by hand was too imprecise to guarantee an equal loss. A surgeon's eye and a farmer's eye do not carry equal value in daily life, and the process itself could easily kill the person, which would turn a limit into an execution. So the ceiling was converted into its practical equivalent, monetary compensation, calculated to match the harm. Full restitution, capped at what was actually lost, nothing more. And this was not a vague, made-up-on-the-spot number. Later rabbinic law, working directly from this verse, built out an actual formula. A person who injured someone owed payment on 5 separate fronts: the value of the injury itself, the physical pain caused by it, the medical costs of treating it, the income lost while the victim could not work, and compensation for the humiliation of the attack. 5 categories, calculated individually, added together, and capped there. That is not primitive justice. That is closer to how a modern personal injury claim gets calculated than to a mob exacting payback. There is one item on that list that never got converted to a payment, and it matters:
Life for life stayed exactly what it says. Israel's law explicitly refused to accept money as a substitute for the life of someone found guilty of intentional murder. So this was never a system where everything, including a human life, had a price tag attached. The ceiling that turned injuries into calculated compensation drew a hard line at deliberate killing and left it there, uncapped in the other direction, because a life was the one thing this law refused to treat as a transaction. That's the entire reversal sitting inside one Hebrew preposition. Eye for eye was never a script for reciprocal violence. It was a formula for proportional restitution, built to stop a judge, a king, or a grieving family from demanding more than what was actually taken. To see how radical that ceiling actually was, look at the law code sitting right next door in history. Roughly 300 years before Exodus was written down, King Hammurabi of Babylon carved 282 laws into an 8-foot stone. And yes, some of them use almost identical language. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye.
But read 3 clauses further, and the resemblance falls apart. Hammurabi's code split society into tiers, and the punishment changed depending on which tier you were born into. If a member of the upper class blinded another member of the upper class, the law really did take his eye. But if that same man blinded a commoner, he did not lose his eye at all. He paid a fine of 1 mina of silver and walked away with both eyes intact. And if he blinded a slave, the payment dropped again to half of what that slave was worth on the market, paid not to the injured person, but to the slave's owner, as if the injury were property damage. Read that progression slowly. In Hammurabi's Babylon, the value of your own eye depended entirely on your social rank. A noble's eye was priceless. A commoner's eye had a price tag of 1 mina. A slave's eye was worth half of whatever someone else could sell them for. The same tiering runs through the rest of the code. Knock out the teeth of your equal, you lose your own teeth. Knock out the teeth of someone a rank below you, you pay 1/3 of a gold mina instead, teeth intact. There is even a specific law about slapping someone's cheek, and the punishment depends entirely on who slapped whom. A commoner who struck a noble across the cheek could receive 60 lashes with a cowhide whip in front of the public. 2 nobles slapping each other cost a mina of silver. 2 commoners slapping each other cost 10 shekels. The exact same physical act, priced differently 4 separate ways, depending on the rank of the 2 people involved. Now put the Exodus law next to it. The text in Exodus 21:24 does not create a separate, cheaper penalty for injuring a poor man instead of a rich man. Eye for eye applies the same ceiling whether the injured party is wealthy or poor. And when the text turns specifically to slaves a few verses later, it does something Hammurabi's code never even considers. Exodus 21:26 and 27 says that if a master strikes his slave and destroys an eye or knocks out a tooth, he has to let that slave go free immediately because of the injury. Not half a mina to the owner, freedom to the person who was actually hurt. This is not a small difference in wording. It is a completely different answer to the question of who counts. Hammurabi's code protected people in proportion to their rank. The Exodus ceiling applied to everyone the same way. And in the one place it singles someone out for special treatment, it singles out the most vulnerable person in the household for extra protection, not less. That difference is not an accident of legal drafting. It goes all the way back to the very first chapter of Genesis, where every single human being, not just kings and nobles, is described as made in the image of God. Hammurabi's stele opens by saying the gods appointed him to rule and prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, yet the code he wrote still prices a person's eye according to their rank. Exodus starts from a different premise. If everyone carries the same divine image, a court has no theological basis for deciding that one person's eye is worth more than another's. The flat ceiling is not a legal accident, it is what the theology demands. There is one more difference worth noting.
Hammurabi's laws were carved in an 8-foot stone pillar and displayed in public, but in a world where most people could not read, that display mattered more to scribes and officials than to an ordinary farmer or laborer trying to understand his own rights. The law in Deuteronomy takes a different approach. Every 7 years, at the Festival of Booths, the entire nation was commanded to gather so the law could be read aloud, specifically to men, women, children, and even foreigners living among them, so that nobody, literate or not, powerful or poor, could claim they never knew where the ceiling stood.
So the next time someone tells you eye for an eye was a symbol of a primitive, brutal religion, hand them this comparison. It was written into a world where the going legal standard was that your eye was worth exactly what your birth certificate said it was worth, and where knowing your own legal protections depended on whether you could read. Exodus erased the discount and made sure everyone actually heard the law that erased it. So if eye for an eye was already a mercy law restraining runaway revenge in a world that had never known a ceiling before, what was Jesus doing when he brought it up centuries later? In Matthew chapter 5, he quotes the line directly, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." That example is not random. A slap to the face was exactly the kind of act ancient law codes used to police social rank, the very scenario where a court would ask who struck whom and price the punishment according to what each person was worth. Jesus takes that specific loaded example and does the one thing no rank-based legal system could ever do. He removes rank from the equation entirely. It no longer matters who you are or who struck you. The response is the same for everyone. Mercy, offered freely, not measured out by a court, and not owed to anyone based on their position. At first glance, that sounds like Jesus canceling the old law. He is not. A few verses earlier, in that same sermon, he already told his audience exactly what he came to do with it. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." The Greek word behind fulfill is pleroho, and it means to bring something to its full, complete expression, not to erase it and replace it with something else. Here is what that means for eye for an eye specifically. The law was never the finish line. It was a floor, the lowest standard a justice system could enforce, a ceiling that stopped courts and grieving families from taking more than what was lost. Jesus is not lowering that floor. He is standing on top of it and pointing higher. The law says, at minimum, do not take more than what was done to you. Jesus says, as a way of life, you are free to take less. That only works as a teaching because the ceiling was already unusual for its time. Jesus is not introducing mercy into a system that had none. He is taking the era's moral outlier, a law built to stop escalation, and extending it from something a court enforces into something a person chooses. He is not telling judges to close the courts. He is telling individuals they no longer have to wait for a judge or claim what is legally owed to them before they choose to let something go. The restraint that used to live in the courtroom now lives in the individual heart, on purpose, before any judge ever gets involved. That is the real shape of the sentence, an eye for an eye, not a command to get even, a limit, first placed on judges, then placed as an invitation on us. Here is what all of this actually means for you, right now, outside of any courtroom or ancient legal code. Every one of us carries some version of Lamech's math. Somebody wrongs us in a small way, and something in us wants to answer in a big way. Cutting comments online, grudges that outlive the offense that caused them, silence that punishes someone far longer than what they actually did to us. That impulse is old. It's the same impulse the book of Genesis recorded thousands of years before anyone wrote a law to stop it. Eye for an eye was never permission to indulge that impulse. It was the first recorded attempt in the Bible to put a hard stop on it, a rule that said your response has to match the offense, not multiply it. And centuries later, Jesus looked at that same rule and asked his followers to go one step further still, not to abandon justice, but to be willing to absorb a cost the law never actually required them to absorb. Think about the last disagreement that actually cost you something: a friendship, a family relationship, a working partnership. Somewhere in that conflict, there was probably a moment where you had every right to take exactly what was owed to you and make sure the other person felt it. Maybe you did. Maybe you're still owed it. This is not a call to pretend the wrong did not happen or to let people harm you without consequence. The law itself never asked for that. What both the law and Jesus are pointing at is the same quiet, unfashionable idea that having the right to full payback and choosing not to collect it is not weakness. It's the exact restraint an entire ancient legal system was built brick by brick to protect. You do not have to take more than what was done to you. That was always true, all the way back to Exodus. And because of what Jesus taught, you are free to take less, not because the offense did not matter, but because mercy was always the point the ceiling was reaching towards. The Bible is deep. It doesn't have to be complicated.